Yeah, great to be part of this yet again. A great response to the one a couple of weeks ago, I think it was now, and a wonderful opportunity to gather in this safe place and speak freely and frankly. I think this pandemic preparedness treaty proposed is just another, perhaps the most egregious attempt yet to usurp the sovereignty of the people. And the sovereignty of the people is something that I think very seriously about and care very deeply about. And then sometimes I think perhaps this has to happen. The people of the member states have to see what their governments have done or proposed to do with their rights. Maybe that has to happen before the people finally stand up as one and say no. I've been appalled, frankly, by what so many people have either failed to notice or have noticed and have simply ignored for whatever reason. And perhaps only when this, what could you call it, this abomination of a treaty is waved through and the next pandemic comes and the treaty comes into force, only then maybe will enough people finally realise what's been done by their governments and in their name. And then maybe we'll see the wild rumpus start. Anyway, without any more ado, I'll hand over to Nick for some opening remarks as well.
Thanks, Neil. Very glad to be here with you. I am a person not afraid of voicing an opinion, but I think tonight we have such a lineup of people whose opinions are nuanced, people who have been on the inside of the beast, so to speak, and who will be able to explain to us exactly what all of this means, what kind of connections we will see, and how much of this is bluster and clumsy statement of intent that does more to expose the anti-human trajectory of the pandemic preparedness. So what I will do, rather than gassing on myself, is introduce this list of panelists quickly. It has a PhD in public health, position with PhD in population health and a background in internal medicine, modeling and epidemiology of infectious disease. Previously, he was director of the Global Health Technologies at Intellectual Ventures Global Good Fund in the USA, program head for malaria and acute febrile disease at FIND in Geneva, and coordinating malaria diagnostic strategy with the World Health Organization. I've known David for a long time, and he is a person of very deep and solid thinking, and I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say about this story. I spoke last week with Dr. Meryl Nass, who I believe is just finishing up her dinner before joining us. She is a physician and researcher who proved the world's largest anthrax epidemic was due to biological warfare. She revealed the dangers of the anthrax vaccine. Her license was suspended for prescribing COVID medications and so-called misinformation, which we all know is true stuff that frightens authorities. She has been questioning and challenging the actions and motives of the World Health Organization, writing a congressional testimony. She writes extensively about WHO and public health in her Substack, Meryl's COVID newsletter. Dr. Kat Lindley is a board-certified family physician, Croatian-born and American-trained, and as we saw in last week's Twitter Spaces, that gives her an amazing perspective, able to relate the period during the Cold War and in the Eastern Bloc with the times that we live through now. And she has a direct primary care practice in Texas. She is the COO of the Global COVID Summit, an organization representing 17,000 scientists and physicians, and president of Texas AAPS. Professor Retsef Levi shot to attention recently, known to us through Israel Leaks, with the video, astonishing video that was leaked out of the Israeli Ministry of Health. He's a professor of operations management at the MIT Sloan School of Management, co-director of the MIT Leaders for Global Operations, expert in risk management, analytics, health and food systems, and safety and manufacturing of biological drugs. He's also an expert in aspects related to the vaccine safety and efficacy and the collateral damage of lockdowns, global supply chains, and healthcare and vaccination. James Roguski is a researcher, author, natural health proponent, and an activist who believes that the old systems are rightfully crumbling, so that we must build their replacements very quickly. James uncovered documents regarding proposed amendments to the international health regulations and was instrumental in raising awareness about them, which resulted in the initial amendments being rejected. James is now doing everything possible to expose the World Health Organization's hidden agenda behind their proposed pandemic treaty, as well as the WHO's ongoing attempts to amend the international health regulations. Dr. Gary Sidley is one of my favorite thinkers in this whole COVID story, and qualified as a clinical psychologist in 1989. In 2000, he obtained his PhD for a thesis exploring the psychological predictors of suicidal behavior. He's a member of Smile Free, Heart and PANDA, and he writes extensively, including for his blog, Corona Babble. Philipp Kruse is a Swiss lawyer. Since the end of 2020, he has represented over 20 court proceedings against harmful and unconstitutional corona mandates for children, entrepreneurs, and Swiss pilots. Since January 2022, he has had a special focus on PCR testing, mRNA, founded at the end of May as a response to the recent World Health Organization developments. And then my fellow South African, Dr. Travis Noakes, leads the Noakes Foundation Academic Free Speech and Digital Voices Research Project. He has a doctorate in communications and media studies from the University of Cape Town, and currently researches scientific dissidents' use of digital voice. David Bell, entitled "Who is Watching the World Health Organization? Post-Truth Movements Beyond Infodemic Research." So there you have it. It's going to be a hot microphone, people. I think we're going to have a lot of fun looking at this very worrying. Thomas Jefferson, one of the most prolific epidemiologists when it comes to respiratory diseases, working closely with Carl Hannigan at the Oxford Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine. And in 2009, after the World Health Organization attempted to launch a swine flu pandemic, replete with vaccines, of course, and so on, in an interview with Spiegel International, the German magazine, he made the comment, "Sometimes you get the feeling that there is a whole industry almost waiting for a pandemic to occur." David Bell, can you fire up your microphone and talk to us a little bit about the history and background of the pandemic preparedness agenda?
Okay, I think the things to keep in mind above all else are two things. One that pandemics are rare. So the WHO, they put out their pandemic guidelines in 2019 before COVID, which was actually a good guideline, and it's put together according to a evidence-based process that WHO is supposed to follow and used to in a lot of things. And those guidelines list pandemics as the 1918 to 20 Spanish flu, which it's acknowledged, and Fauci and others are on papers writing this, that most people died because of lack of antibiotics. They died from secondary bacterial infections that come often with influenza. And 50 million or so died. Since then, there was a listed pandemic influenza in 1957-58 and one in 68 to 69. These killed a little bit more than normally die, about 1 million people. So sort of double what normally dies each year from flu. Swine flu is called a pandemic, but less people died of swine flu in 2009 than normally die of influenza. So since we've had antibiotics, there's been, according to WHO, before COVID, 3 pandemics. The worst of them killed less than the number of people that die every year of tuberculosis, just one disease. So the idea that we're getting more pandemics and they're getting worse over the last century or so is completely false. But we see this written consistently in white papers, documents from the World Bank, WHO, etc., as a statement of fact. So people think pandemics are getting worse, we've got to do something about it. Pandemics are an extremely small health problem compared to the day-to-day endemic infectious diseases and non-communicable diseases like metabolic diseases, diabetes, etc., that affect people and that actually make them much more susceptible to viral illnesses. The other thing that's often said is that because humans are somehow having more contact with wildlife, we're more at risk and we're going to have more and more pandemics. I mean, that's just silly because there's less and less wildlife. There's a huge problem with loss of habitat, which is greatly exacerbated by what's happened over COVID and lockdowns. But humans live much less with animals than they used to. So the whole pandemic industry, and it is an industry, it's rapidly growing over the last 10 years with institutions like CEPI set up just for pandemics, is based on a completely false premise, but which is repeated so often that most people believe it. So I think that the key thing is to undo that first and make it clear that people need to understand that pandemics are a rare event and a very small health burden compared to most others. Yet we see the international public health agenda putting pandemics far above everything else. And I think the reasons for that are clear in that it's very difficult to monetize normal diseases, but it's very easy to monetize what you would claim would be vaccine preventable diseases, especially if you can get to a point where you can mandate vaccines. It's just printing money. And the business imperatives, therefore, of turning international health into a constant run of pandemics with mass and mandated vaccination are just too strong for a lot of people and businesses to overcome. So that's driving this. And the WHO treaty and the international health regulation amendments that we'll be discussing are really based around bringing this sort of agenda to the forefront and essentially putting a large number of corporations and individuals in a position where they can constantly print money on the guise of saving people's health. I think I'll leave it there as a background.
If you could pick it up, Meryl, and continue that idea, maybe develop the idea further of history of the pandemic, the preparedness, the agenda there. I think I'm particularly interested in this idea of changing the definition of a pandemic.
Sure. So I think the first thing I want to say is that the people who have been pushing this idea the most have been Tony Fauci and Peter Daszak, neither of whom we should give one iota of attention to or trust. So the United States has taken pandemic planning and preparation to a high level over the last 20 years since the anthrax letters were sent. And we spent on average until recently about $7 billion a year allegedly for pandemic planning. And what this did was fuel an industry of new businesses, new drugs, new vaccine development, none of which has been of any value to the taxpayer or the citizen. And when we finally did have this so-called pandemic, which of course is man-made, using money in part probably that Fauci has spent, or perhaps in whole, because we don't know really where it came from. But we do know that Fauci has funded coronavirus research over the last 20 years up to $50 million a year. So when the pandemic came, which they could have expected because SARS coronaviruses are on the list of special select agents, which are designated as biological warfare threats, we had nothing in preparation. And despite the fact that there had already been a SARS-1, that was a great concern. So we didn't have the simple things like masks, gloves, gowns, ventilators, face shields, but we also didn't have and could have had monoclonal antibodies. We certainly didn't have any vaccines, and we had drugs that had already been shown in studies by the CDC and NIH to actually kill the SARS-1 virus in tissue culture. We had many drugs that had been identified as killing that virus. Those were the drugs that were suppressed and weren't allowed to be used. So having spent now about $200 billion on pandemic preparedness, what that was done was to actually harm citizens in the United States and not provide them with anything of use. So why do we think if the WHO is made in charge of pandemic planning and we spend the up to $200 billion to build out a worldwide system and increase genomics and increase surveillance and increase research on pathogens, why do we think we will get any more value for money? And why do we think that they won't develop a lot more potential biological agents?
Kat Lindley, if you're there with Meryl, In what way is the internal culture of the public health industries, why is it that their employees have been so readily trapped and captured by the system, such that they become willing or unwilling puppets of their administrations?
I think for United States, at least, our public health officials, in most cases, are not clinicians. Some of them do not have medical degree. And when they look at these, pandemic issues, they tend to treat everything as a statistic. Everything is what is best for everyone else, and they kind of forget what is best for humanity, what is best for the individual. So a lot of these policies have done more harm than good, and there is this increased need to put even more masters of public health officials in charge of these responses. And as we've seen, especially when it comes to medical issues, you need clinicians on the ground to decide how do we respond and what we do, because we know how to adapt, how to change the course of treatment, how to change the dynamics of the situations. And the biggest problem is for many public health officials, not all of them, but many, they look at this just as statistics and numbers, and that's kind of the drawback of the whole response.
The fact that they're not clinicians, and most of them have a master's in public health, means that we have a whole, country of public health officials that work off of algorithms. They work off of plans that they are handed to, that one person in the country is designing. And they don't have the capability of adapting those plans because they're not clinicians.
Right. David Bell, are you still with us? Do you still have your microphone active?
It is now, yes.
Yeah, this idea of the culture of public health, I think you in particular have inside knowledge of that subject. If you could maybe enlighten us further.
Yeah, it's complicated. So I mean, there's not one reason why people do what they do. I think most people in public health have a genuine interest in doing something useful, but most of the funding in public health now, a large part of the funding comes from a very few sources. The big funders, for instance, the Gates Foundation, Wellcome Trust, and so on. So if you want a career in public health, you have to be fairly well in sync with those funders or with the main sources of funding. There's been a change over the last 20 years, which is very significant in the rise of public-private partnerships in public health. And these seemed, initially to be a good idea. Public health, international public health needed more money. Private individuals, foundations, corporations were interested in bringing that money. So the World Health Organization and a lot of non-government organizations happily took this money and worked with private organizations. The problem with this is that private organizations, in the end, particularly corporations, need to make a profit and investors need to make a return on their investment. So it inevitably breaks down the conflicts of interest rules, and even with the best of intention, the main focus of public health becomes what those corporations are interested in and not what the populations are interested in. We see this clearly in pandemics where pandemics are exciting. You can feel, there's a big thing and you're saving the world. So public health people are human, they get excited. It's much more interesting than investigating a diarrhea outbreak in some restaurant every few months. So there's that sort of tendency to go after where the excitement is. There's a tendency to go after the money. There's this change in the culture of funding where the money has come from clearly self-interested entities. And so that has sort of driven international public health away from the alma mater idea of population community-based health to much more a centralized model where influenced by corporations who are on the boards of a lot of these international bodies and are very influential through funding with the World Health Organization. It's moved to a centralized model where they can see quick results and get return on their investment. So it's really changed public health from a relatively low-key population-based, let's slowly improve health metrics to, how can we get a return on investment in a short period of time through
I think that's
something related to people's health.
I think that's a great segue into the really hot topic tonight, which is the World Health Organization and the International Health Regulations amendments. James, are you hot on the mic? Can you answer a question for me? Who do you think gains and who do you think loses with these amendments? Okay, I'm going to throw that question across to Meryl Nass, if she is able to speak.
Okay, so who loses? We haven't talked about the range of changes that are in the amendments, but they are huge. Let me just say to start that the amendments are binding. They're much more binding than the proposed amendments, much more binding than the current international health regulations. And they could potentially be applied, at least if you look at the treaty also, what's been proposed is they could be applied for a potential pandemic, and their range could extend until after the pandemic. So as long you could have a before, during, and after takeover of public health worldwide by the Director General of the WHO or region-wide by the regional directors of WHO. So what happens is that the cost of this proposed pandemic planning program means that the WHO will totally change its focus to be primarily on pandemic planning. There will be less focus on the few things that it does well, such as managing tuberculosis and malaria and parasitic diseases in third world countries. And there will be an enormous number of people in the world who will be dependent on this central authority and therefore will carry out the range of rules that are applied when a pandemic is declared. And part of the proposal is to enforce whatever the WHO says must be done in the name of public health. So we're talking about, some policing system. We're talking about new surveillance, just a range of things that nobody wants. And that because there is this concept of One Health, which claims wrongly that human health cannot be considered in isolation, but must only be looked at in the context of animals, both wild animals and livestock, and plants, all the plants in the world, and ecosystems, all the ecosystems in the world. So by claiming that they are following a One Health model, the regional or the international head of the WHO takes jurisdiction over everything in the planet and could potentially make rules about anything, plants, animals, or ecosystems. So who wins? Well, whoever is the power behind the throne of the WHO is who wins, and who loses is everybody else.
Meryl, what real teeth does the WHO, or as you point out, whoever is actually behind the WHO, what teeth does it actually have? And what difference would it make? Is there a tipping point where, if not enough of the member states wave it through, sign it through, nod it through, and accept this treaty, is there a number of abstentions or people kicking it back that would put it back into the long grass again, as has already happened? Is it weakened by a lack of consensus?
No, it certainly doesn't require consensus. Now, we have a lawyer here, Philipp Kruse, so he'll have to answer some of that. What I will say is that what has been proposed is that because the regulations already exist, that countries would not be asked to ratify them, the new amendments, that basically a representative from country would vote, and if they get a sufficient number of votes, these new amendments will go into force. And they or the pandemic treaty could potentially go into force very quickly. So the treaty proposal that I read suggested that once 40 countries agree, then it goes into effect in 1 month, and then every country individually, as it agrees, it will go into effect 30 days later for that country. And it will take 2 years after you say you want to get out before you can leave. So that was part of the pandemic treaty proposal. The amendments in the treaty have overlapping but not identical proposals, but they're primarily all about cementing control, so that the countries are required to put into place a mechanism for enforcing at all levels, at the state, county, city level, whatever the requirements will be.
Philipp Kruse, are you there? Are you with us?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm speaking from the iPhone from Dr. Maria Hubner-Mock, as I'm not yet part of the Twitter community, but here I'm sitting with Dr. Meryl Nass and with Dr. Katrina Lindley. And we just finished this conference here in Stockholm. So yes, your questions are right at the center of our discussions here. Yeah, we need to understand that there are these two different instruments that were mentioned by Dr. Meryl Nass. One is international health regulations that are about to be changed, where we have seen these far-reaching proposals. They serve, their purpose is actually to serve as a execution and as a how to apply and how to define the rights and the obligations of the different member states under a public health emergency of international concern, and also define under which circumstances the general director can call out public health emergency of international concern. That's the basic situation, and if it is amended, then the principle applies, as Meryl rightfully mentioned, that unless the country does not reject this proposal actively, then it will come into force. Whereas we have also mentioned this other instrument, the treaty, must be ratified on the level of the member states. Now, and therefore it matters which changes will be put into which instruments, but this is sort of a legal detail, as we see a very strong dynamic, and that's possibly your question, a very strong dynamic behind these changes produced directly from the central command of the general director. And from everything we see so far, this is an absolute this is not a democracy. This is steered by a small group around the general director, about those behind the general director. They deliver the proposals. These proposals that come in have just the appearance of being from the member states, but ultimately they are shaped by, we must assume that they are shaped in the general director's under his control or in his group. And still, there is some hope. You were asking whether we have some signals of some resistance or reluctance of member states. And I would say, yes, we can say there is some reason to convince decision makers in our countries to start a process of resistance. And I see two aspects where we have reason to intervene. Number one is the constant, historic, well-established basic standard under every public health system, both on the national level but also on the WHO level. I spoke with Astrid Stückelberger. She has a tremendous experience of over 20 years with the WHO, and she even taught this topic of how to implement these international health regulations in practice. In one aspect, she emphasizes very much is the importance of constant reassessment of the epidemiological risk. How dangerous is the virus? She mentioned that there were 2 cases in the past where WHO, I think it was around 2000 or before 2009, they were under, they almost failed to be sued for calling out, not rightfully, calling out too early and public health emergency of international concern. There were 2 countries that said, well, you will put a lot of harm to our economies, so please better do a proper reassessment of the true danger of this virus and don't call it out too early. Now, what we see now is we see this perpetuated status of fake. You all know what it means, public health emergency of international concern. It's almost as a routine, all 6 months it's perpetuated, and it has never, ever, we have never ever seen just an epidemic that persisted for so long. Also here we have some good experience within the WHO. Usually, it was a matter of a couple of weeks, maybe maximum 1.5 months. Then this emergency was over. Now we have it for 3 years now. And that means, by definition, on the best practice standards, on the public health, that a reassessment of the methods, of the danger of this virus, and of the methods of the all these recommendations that have been given should take place before an enlargement of power and before an emphasis is put onto these methods like PCR test being considered as a gold standard instead of a real doctor's examination and so on. So that's, I think, one aspect where from the legal and also from the practical side, we could very well explain to the decision makers of our several countries, look, they are acting totally against every standard that has so far proven to be the best practice standard. And number two, actually, what Meryl Nass summarized very correctly, this extension of powers and to make it so easy for the general director to declare this fake, even under the assumption that something could be a dangerous virus. We see also this decision-making tree enriched and enlarged. If something cannot be excluded to be dangerous, even then the general director has a reason to call out. So all these enlargements, and most notably the elimination of human rights in the International Health Regulations, Article 3, Paragraph 1, which is so far just a proposal. All this is in direct conflict with some of the most important mandatory rules of the historic United Nations Charter of 1945. Just Article 1 of this Charter says clearly that United Nations was built in order to protect the sovereignty, self-determination of the countries, to protect human rights, to protect dignity, and this was not done just out of the blue because people thought it would be a nice idea to establish a nice treaty. No, it was done with reference to the World War II, and in order to prevent something similar to happen ever again in history of human life. And so what we see with these two instruments, the International Health Regulations and the new treaty, in my view, is in direct conflict with what has been established as a learning from the World War II, and in order to allow a peaceful world with the sovereign states, self-determination, and human rights to exist. So these are, in my view, the most significant points where we can, as human rights, as doctors, as lawyers, human rights fighters, and from the human rights perspective, or as lawyers, or as activists, really kick in and work and have some convincing arguments. Yes.
My first question is, why would the states around the world surrender sovereignty to the WHO? Why would they just surrender power? Just the legal situation for me is very interesting because it's much more complicated than most people understand. I mean, the WHO can maybe decide that a treaty will be in effect as soon as signed, or a regulation, but that doesn't mean that it overrules a constitution of a state, of a country. I mean, they can say, but it doesn't mean they have an authority over a constitution that a country has. Let's say the US, okay? It doesn't mean that, what's the legal situation in your point of view? That's my two questions. Thank you.
Yes, these questions obviously are connected. And first, why would the country possibly give up its right to self-determination? My answer would be because this country would then have politicians in charge that do not understand the far-reaching decision, who have probably conflict of interest, who are already part of this globalist system. So on the top level of all of our countries, what we have seen in the past, I mean, let's be clear about that. We have already in the past 3 years seen a perfect organized structure of command. And there was no hesitation, there was no challenge coming from the member countries. There was a slight difference, of course, between Sweden and Germany. Yes, and we didn't have in Switzerland a vaccination mandate. With respect to mRNA vaccination, there was a difference in practice between some countries and the stricter countries and less strict countries, but more or less, all of these countries had the principle of emergency rule, granting the government an extension of power, which then led to completely useless, harmful measures based on just one sole gold standard, which is the PCR. So they did it already, and we cannot expect that we just wait and see until somebody maybe in the government would react here. They would just give it up. And the next question, what exactly was it? Can you please remind me?
Yes, I was asking about the legal situation hierarchy, if you want, between the decision that the WHO or the UN decide that a treaty is in effect at the moment of signature in face of a constitution. Yeah, thank you.
Right. So we have to differ and make the difference between international health regulations, which will come to effect unless the country within so far 18 months will reject it. They will automatically come into place. We are talking here about these very significant changes of eliminating human rights, of shortening the reporting time, 48 hours. Within 48 hours of the first appearance of a virus, countries have to assess. I have to correct, 48 hours assessment time, but then 24 hours to report. It's a very short time, given the fact that viruses usually take some time to spread. But then, regarding the extension of power, of discretion from the perspective of the general director, this is, in my view, the most frightening modification, because literally by triggering and pressing this button, WHO starts to have all these extra powers. So that part, with some more modifications, will come probably into effect, will be seen as come to effect as soon as it is signed. And when will it be signed? There is the adoption foreseen so far in May 2024. So in a bit more than a year's time. But now with respect to international health regulations, they need to be ratified. They need to be ratified. And also here, I would not be very optimistic, in my view, from what we have seen the past 3 years. They will just do it. They will look at the adopted treaty as of it will be May 2024 and look at it as if it was binding law right from the beginning. And so that means we are in charge. We are the immune system of democracy, of our self-determination, of sovereignty. We have to inform the people. We probably will have to put a strong paper together with the help of James. I'm glad that you're here as well. James Roguski, are you here as well?
Yes, I am. Well, actually, the way I am feeling right now is actually supremely optimistic. And so I'd like to express the reasons why. And first and foremost is the amendments, or the proposed amendments to the international health regulations, are openly being discussed right now in this meeting. And I could not be happier. This is almost more than a dream come true, because they would love to have this information never seen the light of day. That's what they tried to do last year. A little tiny bit of history. The Biden administration negotiated and got 47 nations on board and submitted their version of the amendments, which were actually started by the Trump administration. And so they submitted them a little bit more than a year ago on January 18th and attempted to keep them hidden as long as possible. They never published the proposed amendments on any United States website that I've ever been able to find. And they didn't publish them on the WHO website until the 12th of April last year. And in the span of time, April and May, enough people around the world, got to know about it. And, it was never, the Biden administration's proposed amendments were never really brought to the floor. They were never considered, even though 47 nations immediately supported them back in late January, early February. And that showed that they were conspiring to, prepare this to be run through secretly. Well, this time we have, essentially the proposed amendments that supposedly 16 nations, I don't know what happened to Japan's submission is still invisible, but there's a 197-page document that is readily available on the WHO's website. They created, in order to hijack this supposedly open negotiations with what they set up back in May to be a working group to consider the amendments to the international health regulations, which only met once for 2 days in November. Tedros created a confidential, essentially secret international health regulations review committee. They've met 6 times. The last time they met was from January 9th to the 13th. I'm waiting patiently for them to publish the final report that they submitted to Tedros so that it could then be sent to all of the 194 member nations as a notification that it will be considered during the 76th World Health Assembly, May 21st to the 30th. Now, the reason why I'm very optimistic is that people all over the world, such as everybody here, are talking about this. They are up in arms about it. They are clearly saying no. And, my language is different than many other people's use of the language. This is not going to happen. I do not talk about this as if, when the treaty or if the amendments, the simple answer in my mind is that we have exposed that which they were hoping to keep secret. They were hoping that nobody would pay attention, nobody would discuss this, nobody would realize it was even happening. The people and the nations and the leaders around the world are unaware of this. The only people who are aware of it are the delegates and the people in the WHO. It's their own internal little, quiet thing that they're trying to accomplish. It's out. The cat is out of the bag.
I think what Nick is trying to ask David is what he thinks of the secrecy claim that James was arguing just before. David Bell?
Yeah, thanks. James mentioned that they have put the documents on the website, etc. So there's a lot of detail there. They're not trying to hide what they are doing. I think that, as James mentioned, most people, lawmakers and people globally are unaware of this because, despite COVID, most people don't give a toss about the WHO, really. It's out of their, it's not one of their priorities, international health and international health regulations, and they defer to people who they trust to manage that. Unfortunately, what really happens here is it's not even politicians and health ministers who negotiate this. It's a bureaucracy of international health people who are long-term, very well salaried people whose job is to make rules and hold meetings, and they are doing their job, and this is to their benefit, and they run most of international health, and in the end they make most of the decisions. It's a transparent process, but they assume that people will not take much notice of it. And you can see that because, what this does, Philipp mentioned what it does to fundamental human rights. And to quote that, under the principles in the IHR, they're crossing out regulation shall be with full respect to the dignity, human rights, and fundamental freedoms of persons. They cross that out. They replace it with based on principles of equity, inclusivity, coherence, whatever that means, taking into consideration economic and social development, which means they're taking away the idea of fundamental freedom of persons, and they're placing that on the basis of the economic and social status of people and what the states parties, the countries decide. So it's a complete and fundamental change in the whole understanding of human rights on which the UN is based. But elsewhere in the document, and it reflects that very few people and lawmakers are reading this. The countries on signing this will be saying recommendations are considered as binding. So I see somewhere in the chat said WHO won't have jurisdiction. It will if this is done in the states parties say all the recommendations, what recommendations are now binding. And it has articles which include countries will give up manufacturing know-how and intellectual property when the DG asks them to, and the DG can give it to whoever the Director General, chooses. They will give up the right to control whether their people are confined, whether they quarantine, whether their people can travel, and that will be passed to WHO. They will give up their right to control freedom of expression and cede that to WHO. And this is very explicit in the document. If you take into account the removal of non-binding clauses, so recommendations are now binding. So this goes beyond health, it goes beyond human rights, it goes into the corporate world, and WHO will have control of intellectual property and manufacturing know-how. So this is insane, really, on an international level. But the fact that when it comes to the vote, there will be health ministers voting for this who've never read it, and probably most will not have read it. They would take the advice of their bureaucrats who are part of this group whose self-interest is in getting this through. So I'm less confident than James that this won't get through, but I think it'll become so clear that this is essentially insane from a legal and sovereignty point of view that it will create a huge mess afterwards.
Neil Oliver here. I'm very pleased to hear you both. Yeah. Sorry, Nick.
I was just going to ask you, you've spoken very eloquently about the difference between something being legal and it being lawful. And I've reflected on it and think it's a good thing for the audience to hear right now. I mean, could you draw a bead on that line of discussion for us?
Yes, absolutely. I'm very pleased to hear James being so bullish and also what David was saying in reply. For me, this goes to the heart of what it means to live, as we've been led to believe we understand, in democracies with constitutions. And I think it really strikes me that what people need to be re-educated about or to learn and understand for the first time is this idea that in terms of the common law, which really underpins legal systems around the world, it's the people and only the people who are sovereign. To speak specifically to Great Britain, insofar as Britain has a constitution, it's still, despite what Parliament would like to imagine, it's still enshrined in Magna Carta of 1215, not the rewrite in 1216 or 1297, which is really statute. But Magna Carta is specifically there as the foundation of the freedom of the individual against the arbitrary authority of the despot. The very idea that the British Parliament is sovereign is a fiction. It's a legal fiction. And it's something that they try to they try to hoodwink the people with. But the fact is that the people of Great Britain are sovereign, and the Parliament, no government, no Parliament, can cede the sovereignty of the British people to any foreign authority. They might presume to do so, but if you get people back to the fundamentals of common law, they absolutely cannot cede the sovereignty of the people to a foreign authority, be it the World Health Organization or anything else. And to me, what needs to happen is for the general populations of the member states to be reminded of and made aware of the very profound reality that we, the people, are the sovereign element of all of this. And the very idea, I constantly hear myself saying, who do these people think they are? And as Nick said, we've had conversations offline about this. Just because a parliament or a government passes a law and makes something statutory, makes it legal, doesn't make it lawful. And what is being proposed here in this pandemic treaty is unlawful. I can't really speak to the constitutions of other countries, but as far as the British Constitution is concerned, it is absolutely beyond the remit of a parliament to cede the sovereignty in any way of the people to a foreign power.
Can I add something? This is Philipp here. Absolutely, I agree with you. But we can also be more specific and get some more benefit out of what James said, what David said, and you right now, from the fact that we can look back now and benefit from the experience we have had these past 3 years. We know exactly what happens and what does it mean when the general director calls for an public health emergency of international concern. Then that means that we will have the rule of emergency governing our countries, potentially in all essential elements of our lives, and not anymore the rule of law. And it doesn't matter what kind of constitution you have, in which country you live. Every country has a certain rule of law, a set of standard rules, but this is all superseded by the rule of emergency. And we can now say, look, we're looking at these drafts. It makes it even easier to declare this rule of emergency, to come to the state that we are still in right now. And the powers that are granted to WHO will be even extended to the level that intellectual properties will have to, upon demand, given from the countries or the public-private partnerships or whoever, up to the WHO. WHO can also, based on the treaty, govern the countries to establish infrastructure, to produce vaccines, to produce whatever is needed, and ultimately make recommendations legally binding to govern literally all aspects of our life. So you cannot imagine a more far-reaching power defining what we are allowed to do, when and where. So I think this point James was making, I think, is we have it now on the table, which is great. I mean, we just have to make it easier to understand, somehow translate it, break it down, yes, but it's not a conspiracy theory. It's on the table that they really want to cross out, on the one side, on the level of the people, the basic human rights, and to extend their own powers to an unlimited, unseen, unprecedented extent. And in the middle, we see the governments just serving as their puppets without an own. Yeah, one aspect, the whole of society approach will officially be introduced by this treaty, meaning that literally every aspect of society shall be subject to this logic of emergency. Every aspect shall participate in executing the orders. So if we properly translate that based on the wordings that are on the table, then I am also maybe not so optimistic as James is, but I'm glad that you are so optimistic and bullish. But yes, this is the right way to go, to point that out, what it means based on the experience we have had during the past 3 years.
Thank you for that. Retsef, Levi, are you there? We haven't heard from you yet this evening. Could you speak to whether you are optimistic, maybe from the point of view of the Israeli perspective, or indeed just a personal perspective? Do you feel that the die is cast, or do you think that we can still, as peoples, turn this back?
Okay, so I've listened carefully to what was said so far, and I agree with the consequences of a scenario in which these two instruments are approved. I'm quite optimistic that with the right explanation to the public and politicians, it has a fair chance not to end up passing. I mean, I know at least in Israel that for the Israeli public, the United Nations is not exactly a popular organization, and the thought of giving any authority for an organization like this in Israel is not going to be very welcomed. But I do want to highlight something that I think is equally important, because I think that one of the underlying currents here is a narrative struggle, is an attempt to iron the narrative that the last 3 years were a success. And people talk about pandemic management. I read the pandemic management doctrine, formal doctrine that Israel had, and I also read from more sources about what other countries had. And I think that what we've seen in the last 3 years is essentially a descent, an extreme descent from all principles that we ever had about managing pandemics. No lockdowns was one principle that was violated. The concept of early treatment against respiratory viruses was a very well-known concept. And again, it was not only not pursued, but it was actually actively fought against. The idea of closing schools for long periods of times was considered to be a clearly bad idea, and we've seen that happening. How we approve vaccines completely was thrown through the window. The whole notion of how you think about risk management and really think about high-risk populations versus populations that are not being affected. And if I summarize all of this, I think that there is essentially a militarization of pandemic management, and it really starts with the terminology. If you listen carefully to the way people have talked about the COVID-19 virus, it was in terminology that is really a war terminology. We need to eradicate the virus. We need to, really make it disappear. And at the beginning, these were the lockdowns to do that. And then after that, the vaccine. And that also gave the right to take away many of the civil rights that we all would never imagine that can be taken away. Now, I think that if you read carefully, you actually see this terminology in the WHO descriptions of other aspects and other topics. For example, I don't know if anybody have paid attention to their global initiative to eradicate the polio virus, not to prevent its impact, but to eradicate the polio virus. And that has been used to justify what I would consider excessive vaccination beyond the vaccine that we know that is given in a shot that prevents getting paralyzed. There is now an attempt to call outbreaks in different countries. In fact, in Israel, in 2013, because of an outbreak like this, we brought back the drop vaccine on top of the injection. So I see that as a theme that I think is very, very dangerous because, frankly speaking, to me, pandemic management is not even just a merely health issue. It's really about managing society. And when you look at the overall metrics that we want to maintain and manage, when you manage societies, you have to consider the individuals. You have to consider the totality of health that includes the economics, civil rights, well-being, and so forth and so forth. So to me, the very important fight is to make sure that we are not ironing the narrative that the last 3 years should be an example of how we should manage going forward, just maybe with more central control. And I think that that's kind of the sentiment that comes out of this new treaty. And I appreciate the fact that, yes, the process and the rights that they can obtain if this goes through, these are very important, but I think it's equally important is the narrative and how we make sure that the narrative that the last 3 years were maybe the most significant and historical disaster that already caused and would cause the life of many, many people, especially children and young people. We should make sure that that's kind of is ironed in the mind of people, leaders, and of course the public.
Okay, I think that's a good juncture for us to turn to the question that's really asked here, which is, will people accept this? And the little niggle that I have in my head is that the propaganda has been, for some meaningful proportion of the world's population, very effective. And a very eloquent opinion maker in this regard is my countryman, Travis Noakes. Travis, would you jump in here and just talk us through your views on whether this whole trajectory is going to be accepted by the man in the street?
Well, in South Africa, I think the reported vaccination rate is 27%, which would seem to be optimistic. So I think the public has actually rejected quite overwhelmingly in South Africa, certainly, the forced vaccination message. However, having said that, it's a bit like being under apartheid in a way, in that there is no alternative view put in, let's say, the broadcast media to alternative policy. So that's a major concern. So we don't get to hear about alternatives to vaccination, preventative health measures, whether masks are ineffective. There is very little debate that occurs within our broadcast media.
And the media is completely silent on the fact that these health regulations are being amended.
Yeah.
Travis, can I ask, while we have you there, to what extent do you think that the man in the street takes or would even begin to take the World Health Organization seriously as an entity that could ever seek to wield this kind of power over their day-to-day lives? I would have thought if the media in my country here in Britain were to point this out and to make this plain to people, I think the majority of the population would say, who are the who? Who does the who think they are? And why would any of us for a moment take seriously the World Health Organization taking on the role of world dictator? I just don't see, when this finally gets out into the public domain properly, I would have thought most people would laugh up their sleeves at the audacity, far less kowtow to the diktats.
Well, I think the social distancing issue is a fantastic example of that. Most South Africans live in very close proximity to each other in shacks. So here you are saying there needs to be a minimum of 6 meters between you and your countrymen. That's not going to work.
The WHO are having this conversation with themselves. You know, the WHO and the delegates are having this conversation with one another. And, well, who knows the extent to which it has been kept away from the public and whether it's been, trying to be pushed through as a kind of an international, transnational sleight of hand. But eventually, the general population, in the face of the next pandemic or whenever, has to be made suddenly aware of the WHO taking this kind of power unto itself. And I just don't predict that the mass of the population are going to accept the authority of an organisation that hitherto they might not even have bothered to consider even exists.
Neil, I'm going to jump in and agree with you. And I had the same sense just listening to these executives with their commentary on the World Economic Forum's recent shindig in Davos. It's essentially masturbatory. They're in these halls together, banging back and forth the crazy jargon of climate crisis, blah, 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 ESG, blah, 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 stakeholder governance, blah, blah, blah. And you get the impression of people who are completely disconnected from reality. I think that's very much in play here. There seem to be people who sincerely believe that all of this centralization and power in the hands of unelected bureaucrats is a great idea because in their minds, these are global crises that demand global solutions. But any sensible person can see straight away that the circumstances on the ground vary from country to country, and that one thing we do not need is a one-size-fits-all solution to any of our problems. It's just, as I say, it has the appearance of a masturbatory process.
Yeah, absolutely.
People who are disconnected.
When I look at the way in which, the WEF has suddenly come to prominence to some extent here in Britain, and I don't know the extent to which it's come to prominence around the world, but having been exposed to the open air and to the sunlight, the WEF is already something of a laughingstock. A lot of what you see on social media, a lot of the way in which it's portrayed, a lot of the ways in which, the likes of Klaus Schwab is portrayed, it's becoming comedy. And it's becoming something that is roundly ridiculed. So it doesn't really do well when it's exposed to the glare of publicity. And I suspect that the same thing happens with the World Health Organization, that when they finally have to come forward and say, you may not have heard of us, but we're now in charge, that the response from the mass of the population will be, and just who do you think you are?
Sorry, I just want to do one comment. The people are rejecting it, there is no doubt about it, and more people know, more they will reject it. But I think we have to be careful not to kind of be a little bit too arrogant, because it doesn't matter whether we reject it or not, our legislature has to reject it. And at least in the United States, we do have Chip Roy, who filed a bill to defund WHO, and then Texas and Oklahoma actually sued and are stating that they will not comply to any of the regulations if they ever are adopted. So I think those are the conversations we have to have, because it's not whether people will reject it, it's whether our legislation is going to have enough courage or balls to really reject it, because that's where the fight is really going to be ultimately.
Yeah, I hear you, Kat, but I think actually perhaps the time has come to be arrogant. You know, I think it's high time that the sovereign populations around the world were arrogant in the face of this kind of temerity.
So, Neil, this is Retsef. I think I would like to emphasize again that I know it's very tempting to focus on this organization or that organization, but to me, what matters even more are the ideas that this treaty represents. Because even if this treaty is not going to pass and the World Health Organization is not going to get these rights, we have to understand that behind this organization, there are actually much more powerful organizations that I believe are just using the WHO channel to try and get through some ideas. So I think that as we fight this, we need to fight the ideas just as much as we fight the authority of one organization or another. The ideas are wrong. The ideas that the last 3 years is a model that we need going forward to replicate and even make more extreme. This to me is the most significant fight that we need to absolutely make sure that that's not going to stay the narrative.
I couldn't agree with you more, Retsef. I've said this for a long time now. The ideas are the true viruses that we have to worry about. And that's where our work really needs to focus, is on explaining, and finding better ways to articulate what is wrong with all these buzzwords. What is wrong with the doctrine of centralization, of sustainability, the DEIs, diversity, equity, and inclusivity. What's wrong with all of these ideas? What are they driving towards? People need to have the ability to grab the handles, the information that will help them understand that these little words are actually very pernicious. They're bad memes that have spread virally and that threaten all of the best of human society and dramatically curtail the potential for human flourishing. I think that's very squarely where it's at. We will see people start to understand and start to push back against this when those words stopped washing over them like water, and they actually begin to pay attention to the hidden meaning, the subtext of all of these concepts.
Yes, as I said at the opening of this, to some extent, I think this has to happen. And the WHO coming forward with a treaty, a proposed treaty like this, it has to happen, and it possibly even has to be ratified by member states, because then and only then will it be inflicted upon people with the advent of whatever is the next emergency. And then we'll see the mettle of the people or not. But it has to be made real. I think, when it's kept out of the public eye and it's just the stuff of talking shops, we can get as aerated as we like about it. But the test will be if it gets ratified and if it gets inflicted upon the people. And at that point, we'll actually see how much the people care to be told that their democracy and their constitutions are null and void.
Yeah. Travis, have you paid attention to the case that is being brought by Children's Health Defense against the Trusted News Initiative?
Yes, it's a very exciting development. As usual, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and the Children's Health Defense are doing fantastic work. Here they are effectively defending new non-mainstream online news publishers like Trial Site News, Creative Destruction Media, Health Nut News, Gateway Pundit, Truth in Media, Mercola. I'm sure you're familiar with most of those. And making a very interesting argument that they produce a COVID-19 news product that is being boycotted by the defendants, the BBC and Trusted News Initiative, together with the Washington Post, Reuters, and Associated Press, and largely together with big tech companies that are all part of this big Trusted News Initiative, namely Alphabet's Google, Meta's Facebook, Microsoft's LinkedIn, and Elon Musk's Twitter as well, making sure that they answer to claims of collusion and that the Trusted News Initiative is guilty effectively of a group boycott in suppressing true stories. Effectively, that can range from the kind of COVID-19 origins to Hunter Biden's laptop, but effectively that these stories should be communicated and not censored from the public. The public has a right to know. And yeah, effectively, the kind of almost commercial conspiracy of these big tech groups have prevented these smaller, new kind of non-mainstream news publishers from making a sound business because they're being boycotted. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, we've been speaking about the pandemic preparedness industry, but another industry that is growing very rapidly with its own intrigues and interests is the fact-checking industry, which I understand is now pretty large, and for the most part, in a cost-saving exercise, offloaded onto poorer countries. So you've got legions of people in India, gnomes behind computers. Gary has been very interesting in talking about the impact of the nudge units, which go hand in glove with the other topic that I was talking about, the fact-checking industry. Gary, you've spoken very eloquently about the nudge units. How do they fit into this picture of the promotion of pandemic preparedness?
Okay, I'd like to take a rather different angle on this, actually, because I think there would be broad agreement that to effectively resist the various globalist agendas, what we do need most of all, I believe, is active dissent, visible dissent from the average man and woman in the street. And so the key question for me is then how can we actually get to the point where more and more people are showing resistance and dissent? And I think an important way would be by enabling a significant number of people to understand and recognise how they've been psychologically manipulated by their governments over the last 3 years and beyond. And there's been several ways in which they've been psychologically manipulated, but the one that I'm interested in, as Nick has mentioned, is around behavioural science strategies, otherwise known as nudges. For those who are not familiar with behavioural science, nudges are a psychological technique of persuasion that often acts upon their targets below the level of awareness, so they're not aware that they're actually being influenced. It exploits the fact that human beings tend to spend 99% of the time in automatic pilot. So we don't really deliberate or think about our actions almost all the time. We just respond in a kind of reflex automatic way. And the nudges exploit that. Now, we've been bombarded with a variety of nudges over the last 3 years or so, but the three that have caused major concern are with regards to what the behavioural scientists called affect, ego, and norms, which is all very kind of academic language for fear elevation, shaming, and peer pressure stroke scapegoating. And I won't go all through examples. We all know what we've been bombarded with, but it's worth reminding the man and woman in the street about the fear elevation. You know, the way that it's exploited the fact that humans, when frightened, are quite compliant. So we've been scared with death counts and scary footages and mantras like if you go out, you can spread it and people will die. We've been shamed, and we should remind, again, the general population about this, how they've been shamed throughout this period, exploited as being the way that we want to maintain a positive self-image. So what the nudges did was equate virtue with compliance with the restrictions, with things like, you know, don't kill your gran, stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives, even telling young people that their vaccination is necessary if others are to return to normality. I think that was, and excuse the pun, that was shameful. And peer pressure, of course, it's very uncomfortable to be or believe ourselves to be in a small minority. Anyone who's wore a mask in a room full of masked people will be able to identify with that. So what we've got to do, I think, is actually make the person in the street aware that they have been manipulated, because I think most people in the knowledge that they have been used and manipulated in that way, would be visibly resistant to these agendas, whether they be about pandemic management, vaccination rollout, digitalisation, the green agenda, plant diets, etc. The worrying thing, though, is that these behavioural scientists are everywhere. They're ubiquitous and expanding. They're seeping into every nook and cranny of national and global infrastructure. We had the Behavioural Insight team that started back in 2010 with just 7 people in the Cabinet Office of the UK government. That's expanded, and now they're active in Canada, Latin America, Caribbean, USA, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, France, just to name a few. We've all had the advisory groups. I know here in the UK we had the Specialist Behavioural Science Advisory Group for the SAGE, called Scientific Pandemic Insight Group, SPIB. We've got, here in the UK anyway, we've got behavioural scientists embedded in every department of the UK government. In fact, some of you might be interested to know that a Freedom of Information request revealed that in the Department of Work and Pensions, there are 16 behavioural scientists. In the Department of Revenue and Customs, the tax office, there are 54 behavioural scientists. Don't know what they're doing, but the amazing number of these people around. And we've got them employed in the Cabinet Office, the Rapid Response Unit, the Counter Disinformation Cell, and the Army's 77th Brigade. That's sinister, isn't it? Apparently that's a combined regular and Army Reserve unit using, and I quote, non-lethal engagement and legitimate non-military levers deploying targeted information, unquote. And then the World Health Organization itself has got their own little group now of behavioural scientists called the TAG, Technical Advisory Group, chairperson of whom is a certain Professor Susan Mickey, who's, anyone in the UK will know, is a staunch pro-COVID restriction advocate and a lifelong member of the Communist Party. If you look at the stated functions of this TAG group at the World Health Organization, a couple of them, and I'll quote, is the development of an operational framework for the mainstreaming of behavioural insights and sciences into the World Health Organization operations. And another function is behavioural sciences can be mainstreamed across most public health issues and functions to help accelerate the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals and whose global and regional programmes of work. So, yeah, the state's use of behavioural science raises a whole range of ethical concerns, which I haven't got time to go into here, maybe another time. But the pressing need is to increase public awareness, in my view, of the way people have been exploited in this way. If people knew more about this, I believe that there would be more visible resistance to these globalist agendas. I've tried, along with many other people this last 3 years or so, to get a discussion or a debate going about nudging and the way that we've been psychologically manipulated in this way. For example, I and 46 other psychologists contacted the British Psychological Society back in January 2021, raising some concerns, but eventually the British Psychological Society responded saying they didn't recognise any problems of ethics. They were very appreciative of the way the psychologists had operated and said that they all displayed, and I quote, social responsibility, unquote. I tried to get an independent inquiry through a government select committee back in January 22, but they came back saying no current plan to undertake such a review. There was no mention of behavioural science in the draft terms of reference for the UK's COVID inquiry back in March 2022. And I even got a personal message from someone at the Behavioural Insight Team Communication Office denying any responsibility that they encouraged the use of fear, shame or peer pressure. So they were clearly opting out, it wasn't them. And the chair of our behavioural science subgroup, the SPIB, Professor Anne John, said on the 10th of March that even their group never advised on increasing fear and said that they didn't make policy decisions. So to round off, despite my and many other people's best efforts to get someone in power to take responsibility for using nudges, all we could get out of them was a collective scream of, "It wasn't me." So I think it's important that we continue to raise awareness of state-sponsored and ethical nudges, as until we get more visible dissent amongst the average man and woman in the street, I think we are really going to be struggling to halt this World Health Organization agenda.
I think a couple of speakers tonight have alluded to the idea that there might be behind the WHO, there are others whose names and motivations aren't quite so public even as those of the WHO, that there are other invisible hands. I wonder, to what extent do you think that we're just under one long sustained nudge as a population by everyone? We're being nudged by government, we're being nudged by the World Economic Forum, we're being nudged now by the World Health Organization with this pandemic preparedness treaty. I just wonder, could you speak to the notion that it's just, we're now the victims of one sustained nudge?
I agree totally, Neil. They come at us in all directions. But I think what is important, and the key message I'm trying to get across here, is that I think if more people were aware of how they've been psychologically manipulated over the last 3 years, we would get far more visible dissent. Not everybody, of course. There are some people who support, I guess, the agendas that are being thrust upon us. But there are a lot of people in that silent middle that if they realised the extent, as you're saying, Neil, of the way that we have been nudged, manipulated. In fact, I don't like the word nudge in a way because it makes it sound a little benign, doesn't it? It's kind of a friendly word, but it's not. No, it's exploited and manipulated. And I think if people were aware of the extent to which that has been inflicted upon them, I'm sure we'd have much more visible dissent. And I have a strong belief that if we can get bottom-up resistance that is visible and clear and unambiguous, don't have to be the majority of the population by any means. It's just a significant minority, more than who are expressing dissent at the moment. If we can get that, then I think we would have a much better chance of resisting some of these egregious agendas.
I hear you, Gary, but I do wonder at the extent to which what you're suggesting, it falls into that category, does it not? It's easier to fool someone than to persuade someone to accept that they've been fooled. I've tried in my own small way on GB News and the rest to suggest that people have been nudged. And I don't think people like hearing it, because to accept that you've been psychologically manipulated is bad for people's ego, isn't it? It makes them feel as if they've been dupes, and people don't like to accept that.
That's a valid point, Neil. I've watched you many times on your show doing just that and bringing that issue up. And it's a bit of an art as to how to get people to listen and collaborate and acknowledge that they may have been kind of going down a wrong path. Yeah, that's a difficult one. I think you've got to pitch your arguments at a level that's not too far away from where they currently are at. But I suppose that's an whole new different session that I'll happily talk about if I got the opportunity, because I think it is an important issue.
Great stuff, Gary.
I think we need to move along a little bit. I was kind of keen, Travis, if you're still there, and just have some thoughts very briefly on that fact-checking industry issue I tried to raise with you.
Sure. So much as there have been huge growth in the pandemics industries, I think big disinformation is allied to it, in that it is possibly a billion-dollar industry. Reporting around it is financially is not well done. So that could make an interesting research project in itself. But if you think of what it covers in terms of defining what misinformation is, moderating it on social media, multiple platforms, sponsoring international research collaborations such as infodemic research, large organizations running public events such as the UN and EU, initiatives and reports on combating what they view as disinformation, and then also preparing communication guides, such as the Rockefeller Foundation's messaging handbook on COVID-19 testing and tracing. There's a huge amount of activity that is happening. And even if we just look at Facebook's example, where they have to employ 15,000 content moderators, directly or indirectly, and they're only covering 70 of 110 languages on that platform, and they can't address dialects either. So even if they're paying very low rates in India of $2, but in America $20, you average that out, and it's a huge amount of money that Facebook is spending every day to moderate content. And of course, most of the bad work is being done in India and in Africa, the underpaid work. Let's put it that way.
If I may, I don't think these are just humans. I think that there are now increasingly sophisticated algorithms that can do a lot of this work. I think that Google and their search engine and what YouTube and what Facebook are showing and what messages they're showing to whom are even maybe more impactful in nudging and also creating closed words where you only hear certain opinions and you don't hear others. So I think that fact-checking clearly is a bad thing, but I'm not sure it's the worst thing in terms of what the big tech companies are currently doing to shape public opinions on the most important aspects and matters of our life, not necessarily representing the entirety of the ideas and opinions, but more and only sometimes what they would like to show to people. So a lot of this is now being automated. I just want to highlight this.
This is Meryl. I wonder if I could break in for a moment. I'd like to say that although a huge infrastructure has been created to make people think that misinformation and disinformation are crimes and must be stopped, that in fact there is extensive national and international and in the US state laws pointing out that all of this really comes under freedom of speech and people are legally allowed to say basically whatever they want, apart from crying fire in a theater. And so, of course, in the US, it's the First Amendment is the underlying thing at the national level. But we also have the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 19, which says everyone has a right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media, regardless of frontiers. And we have the 1966 International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and 173 nations are parties and have ratified this as a treaty. And it says, quote, everyone shall have the right to freedom of expression. This right shall include freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, either orally, in writing, or in print, in the form of art or through any other media of his choice. So I want people to be aware that they actually have rights, that they're being, the wool is being pulled over their eyes to make them think that they cannot say anything if it's misinformation or someone decides it's disinformation. They have the right to say anything they want legally.
If I may, I know we're closing up. There's probably only about 10 minutes left. I hope we can do this again soon. I've got at least 10 things that I'd like to rattle off here real quick that we're not going to have time to talk about. The Elephant in the Room is an article I published just a few days ago. Please be aware that there are more people in Africa than there are in the Americas, but only 60,000 people per year died in Africa per year due to COVID. Divide that by 1.2 billion, 16 times as many people in the Americas died as in Africa, but yet their equity would have them transport and import and colonize Africa with the pharmaceutical hospital emergency industrial complex's failed strategy. Now, I want everyone to please remember, we're talking about two very separate documents that they're dealing with. The proposed amendments to the international health regulations and the proposed pandemic treaty. People get them cross-pollinated. They're very different. And the WHO has stated very clearly multiple times in all of their documents that these are not scheduled to be considered for vote until 2024. We are way ahead of the game. They shall not vote on this year. They have said over and over and over again that the public must, be heard, and that I'm not fear-mongering that this is going to happen in March. I'm saying very boldly and clearly that it absolutely will not happen. I said March, I meant to say May. It will not be happening in 2023. Now, there are people around the world who have already spoken up. And what I'm calling on everyone to do is be the media. Go to screwthewho.com and you'll see hundreds of videos by many people who have already put their words together back in September to speak strongly against the treaty. And I believe that they have sown the seeds of their own destruction with the proposals that are already in print. Everyone may be looking at the 46-page summary that's been put together by the International Health Regulation Review Committee, which seems like everybody's in agreement, but they actually agreed to not attribute each separate piece of that document to the nation that submitted it. When you actually read each nation's submission, you will see that there is conflict from nation to nation to nation. And once they all begin to realize that these groups of nations and these groups of nations and these groups of nations have very different opinions about how the international health regulations should be amended, you're going to see conflict like you've never seen before. And it's sowing the seeds of the destruction of the WHO. And I am very confident that once people see what this is, because they have chosen, when I said it was secret, it didn't mean that I didn't understand how government works in secret. That's not what I'm talking about. What I was talking about was they purposefully are talking about the treaty as a decoy to get you to not pay attention to the clear and present danger of the proposed amendments. And nudging is one thing, but once people realize what is really going on, we, the people of the world, are going to shove these documents back in their face, and it is not going to happen. Thank you.
That's the kind of language I like to hear.
Yeah, and actually, Neil, a great note to end the discussion on, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I came into this discussion tonight with some trepidation. It's such a huge topic, it's such a huge concept that an organisation such as the WHO would seek to obtain and be encouraged to seize this kind of authority and this kind of influence and totalitarian impact. But having listened to the speakers and listening to James there, I'm completely reassured, because my instinct, although I'm sure many people are very intimidated by the thought of what the WHO is pushing at here, but I think the people finally, when they're confronted with the reality of this, however that manifests itself, the people will kick this into the distance. That is my instinctive response to what is proposed, and to hear it being said first by others has been hugely reassuring for me.
I'm just questioning that. I think we have to be real on this. We've just had 3 years where people complied with, there are still people in parts of America wearing masks on the beach, in the rain, in the wind, 100 yards from the nearest other person. We've had people accepting curfews, which are just, obviously an insane, ridiculous way to manage a respiratory virus. We've had playgrounds taped off, and nearly all the parents will just not let their kids play there because someone put a tape over the slide because of a pandemic. So people will accept almost everything, and the behavioral psychology behind this is very strong. It's continuing, it's increasing. So that will stop a lot of people from seeing what's going on. I think there's a history in the world of ethnic cleansing in Germany, in the Balkans, in Rwanda, etc., which shows us slavery, past histories in South Africa, Australia, and so on, which show us what ordinary people are capable of doing if their self-interest in the short term is perceived to be in complying. So I think we have to be realistic. We also have to be realistic. This isn't just the WHO. The G20 has its own papers on this. The World Bank has its financial intermediary fund, where the WHO is a technical partner but not running it, etc. So there are a number of different angles that people are using who are, it's not WHO who's trying to take over the world. It's a sort of broader thing, and WHO is being used willingly at the top, at least as a tool. But, I think Retsef said we have to fight the idea. I think that's right, not just the WHO, but we've got to start to really hit back and undermine the whole concept of what's happening behind this, the removal of basic individual sovereignty, the human rights that came in after the Second World War, etc., the idea that all people are equal. And so we have to go a lot deeper than the WHO, because people will accept that if they're told it's for their own safety. People have to see their self-interest is in overturning this, and they won't see that until it's too late, unless we go a lot broader with the movement that's driving this. Thanks.
I hear you, David, and I think you're right. I think, though, that there's a difference here in what's being proposed in this treaty, which is about many more mandatory ideas and contents within it. The idea of people being left with absolutely no choice, that even were they prepared to put up with the slings and arrows of their neighbour's condemnation, they would be mandated to receive this, that and the next thing. I think that's what is profoundly different about what's being proposed here. And I just know, speaking only for myself, that this is a yoke of tyranny under which I will not live. And I know that there are other people who are as strongly minded as I am about this. And I will absolutely not accept this. And I cannot be alone. And I know I'm not alone. And my faith is that I'm not alone in saying that absolutely not. I will not take this.
No, I agree, Neil. There's some aspects of this where people will, that's why I brought up the intellectual property issues, etc., where a lot of people who would otherwise be on board will see how insane this is. And I think that's where we need to work on those, so that we need to find ways that people can see that their self-interest is directly affected by what's going on, because otherwise, with the Trusted News Initiative, etc., they will never hear what's going on until it's too late for them.
Meryl,
Yes.
A last word from you quickly.
Basically, I wanted to agree with David Bell. I think it would be more productive if people thought of this as the United States and the World Bank working through the WHO to take sovereignty of the world. And I think we should also expect that they are going to jettison some of the most annoying provisions. So they'll probably get rid of the intellectual property provision, for example. And then they'll tell us that they've made it a much more humane treaty, much more humane amendments. They'll jettison some, and they'll pull the wool over our eyes and push through the rest. I think it's notable that the United States proposed the original 12 amendments last year and then withdrew 11 of them, and that the one that remained was to rush the process through. So I'm surprised at what James Roguski said, because he and I last week agreed that they're probably going to push this through this year rather than waiting until next year, because they're having so many meetings close together. And we should anticipate this could well go through within 4 months.
Meryl, we're very much in agreement. I think that they would like to do that. And I'm here to say that we're going to do everything we can to ensure that they don't.
Great.
Okay, I'm going to make my closing remark here to say that we are the people who are on the side of the truth. We are the people with the courage. And that counts a lot. These cowards and adherents to the moronic ideas of centralization, of all of this completely bananas capturing of the human spirit and its devolution into a world of fear and safety. They're not going to win. They cannot. If any of their plans are implemented, it will spell immediate disaster. And I think then that self-interest that Neil Oliver was talking about will be invoked very quickly. And all the nudges in the world will not be able to overcome that instinct. So I'm very buoyed by this evening's conversation. I have learned an enormous amount. Thank you very much to our panelists. This has achieved exactly what I was looking for. So thank you. And thank you, Neil, once again, for another great conversation.
Let's just do a quick closing remarks from all our hosts and speakers, if anyone wants to add in a sentence.
I'll start. I lived under totalitarian regime. I really understand what it means not to be free. And I've been doing a little bit of nudging on my own, Gary, on my Twitter account. And one of the things I'm trying to remind everyone, freedom is our birthright. And we have to stop giving it away, because, they haven't taken anything away from us. We've just given it away. And now is the time to remember I'm going to say it again. Freedom is our birthright, and we need to leave it for our children, for generations to come, and we need to fight for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kat. Great comment. James, would you like to add?
Hi, everybody. It's James Freeman. Well, listen, thank you. I think it's been really interesting debate tonight. There's just a couple of things I'd like to pick up on. Nick, I absolutely loved your description of the behaviour of the WHO as being masturbatory to describe its belief that it can just do what it's doing. And secondly, I'll also say about the nudge unit. I think it's really important that we try and avoid that word, because when you look at what the government was doing with masks, which were clearly there to create fear, the TV ad campaigns, the government posters, the death counts, the arrows on our high streets, you know, to separate distance with people. This was a psyop, and I think we need to make sure that we are clear in that language, because I do agree. I forget who said it, but I think using nudge does suggest something quite benign. But yeah, great debate tonight. Thank you very much, everybody.
Yeah, I just want to say that I think that we need to remember as we fight this that we are the mainstream. People try to present us as these kind of hallucinating, anti-whatever, dissenting voices. No. We are what would be considered mainstream up to 3 years ago. And we are continuing to be the mainstream. So the people that dissented are all of these people that have implemented, crazy failing policies that goes against any principle of science, ethics, anything we've known until 3 years ago. And I think we need to remember that and be very confident that we are representing the mainstream.
I just have absolute faith in my fellow men and women on this planet. And the more I get to know them, the stronger that faith is. And every time I talk, I give my phone number. So if you have something to write with, I'm going to do it here as well. It's in the United States, so the country code is +1. If you use Signal or Telegram or WhatsApp or whatever, it's all the same. 310-619-3055. I am that serious that we are going to win this, and the world will be a better place because of we the people, in spite of the people who are trying to dominate us.
It's the silent middle, I call them. These are the people that haven't really shown much visible dissent as yet. We've got to kind of nurture them, be kind and compassionate to them, and have conversations with them to empower them really to start to express resistance. Not necessarily in a revolutionary kind of, destructive way, but to actually have conversations with people, to let people know that we don't agree with this, that we're not on board. And I think the tide is turning, to end on a positive note. I think people are coming over to our side. I think people are waking to what's gone on. So let's hope that process continues and accelerates over the next few months. Thank you.
Yes, Gary, and I would say you're right, not a revolution. I've said it before elsewhere that what's required is a renaissance. I think we need to remember basics like common law, like natural law, and what's been attempted in legislation like the proposed treaty there is an inversion of natural law. It's a corruption of common law. And for that reason, because everything about it is upside down, inside out, back to front and wrong, even if it's attempted, it won't prevail.
I think on that, I just add to what Kat said. We need to remind people that we are actually born free. It's freedom's not something which generous rulers grant to us. We need to start from that basis.
If I may, I would like to have a final note. Like Kat, I too have, as a Jewish person, an Israeli one, and a descendant, I have major lessons from history of my own. And I truly believe that we are born free and we must respect it. It's an obligation. It's not only a right. And I'm a little bit less optimistic than you because my legal point of view of the situation. But I am definitely on your team of resistance, Neil and everyone else. I am team resistance completely. This is not going to be obligating me in any way. And just one final note, I want to personally thank Sean Flanagan, who recently returned to Twitter from exile and was a very important person behind the scene, initiating and executing these conversations. So Sean, great to have you back, and thank you.
Good. Yeah, bless everyone. Lots of love. Fantastic to be with you, and I'm looking forward to doing it again.